So now for someone who's not German, I'd like to introduce Cameron Briggs from Origin Energy in Australia. Origin is a very interesting company. I don't know how many of you have been to Australia. Origin is one of the largest energy retailers and traders in Australia. They're actually younger than Intertrust by a significant order of magnitude. We were founded in 1990. They were founded in 2000, and they grew very rapidly into what they are today. Cameron is in charge of Origin's Silicon Valley operation. His job is to make sure that they're a major in 10 years' time, but also a global major in 10 years' time. And he's been involved in a lot of really exciting activities, both in terms of strategic partnerships and strategic investments, both in the Silicon Valley area and across the United States and the world. He's going to be speaking about a subject that I find intriguing, which is peer-to-peer energy distribution. So you guys remember in the old days with music and media, people were looking at distributing songs on the internet in a fairly structured top-down way. And then all of a sudden, it was Napster probably was first. People realized that you don't need to have a server to send songs out. You could do it from computer to computer. Well, here's an interesting issue, which is you could probably do that with anything on the internet. And Cameron's been thinking about and studying systems to distribute electrons in a peer-to-peer way, or not. And he's about to walk us through his thoughts on the subject. Cameron Briggs.
Thanks, Talal. I have a short amount of time, so I won't talk to you necessarily about what Florian mentioned before, that we're an industry that's actually going through some changes. And one of the things that I've been the beneficiary of is a conga line of people waiting out the front of our office to help me go through that change and help me understand how I'm going to be disrupted and, in fact, wanting to disrupt me. So one of the critical things in terms of the big changes for an energy sector is the prevalence of renewable energy, and in particular solar energy. Solar is an amazing source of energy because it has one simple fact going for it. It doesn't suffer from diseconomies of scale when you deploy it. So that means if you want to deploy it at a house, at a factory, or in a big large field, you don't suffer necessarily deficiencies in terms of how that might be deployed. In Australia, I'm pleased to say that we have one of the highest rates of penetration of solar in the world. I think 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 houses in Australia have solar energy. And people love solar. Why do they love solar? They want to feel independent, they want to feel autonomous, they want to feel like they're making a difference to the world, they want to save a little bit of money, and you know what? You create quite a few jobs with solar energy. It's quite labour intensive. So governments, to their credit, have probably cottoned on to this and realised it's not such a bad thing after all, this solar energy. And without doubt, in each of different markets, they've been encouraging and driving the adoption of solar energy, often through government incentives or government initiatives. And that can take the form of many different things. One, like you get, I think, in Germany and in Japan, which is a feed-in tariff, where they pay you large amounts of money for the energy you generate. It might be to do with giving you reductions on the capital to deploy solar, like they do in Australia. And in the US, it might be a combination of giving you a discount off the capital amount, but also in the way that it's structured. And in particular, net metering, where you get the same amount of money for exporting energy back into the grid. So in Australia, we have a combination. We have where the government will give you a pretty high percentage of the capital for energy off in terms of deploying solar. But in Australia, if you export energy back into the grid, that's excess solar energy, you'll get paid the wholesale price, not the retail price. So if you think of those two different economic drivers, it takes you to a certain outcome, and that is that what you want to do is put as much solar on your roof, but not so much that you actually have excess energy going back into the grid because it becomes economic. So this is, for many innovative companies, the mother lode. This is the use case of peer-to-peer energy. And how it works, so I'll try and replay the conversation to you that I've had, and I won't pick on any particular companies because there's been at least 7 or 8 of them. And here's what happens. You come here, you have someone who has a large amount of solar energy. They have excess solar energy. They can export it back into the grid, and those miserable energy companies will only give them the wholesale price. But if they shift that energy and they sell it to their neighbour, that neighbour can buy energy cheaper than they would buy from the retail, and they will buy it off you more than the wholesale price. So in some sense, that makes a lot of sense. You win as the exporter, they win as the customer, and in some sense, this is a really great thing for the economy. But it doesn't work. What happens is that the reason why you get a disparity in terms of the retail price and the wholesale price is a structural issue. And the structural issue is it's the price you pay to distribute energy around your system. So we then have a pretty uncomfortable conversation where people telling me don't understand. We run an experiment. We did that. We got 50 houses that had solar, 50 houses that didn't solar, ran an experiment and realised there's no economic value to be had. The only value came from us giving up margin to our customer. So we had the inevitable discussion, but they said, but look, it's got blockchain. I said, well, that's good. But look, it's got, it doesn't have to be proof of work. It can be proof of stake. And I ask, is there proof of life? And everybody gets very uncomfortable. And then the next conversation is we have tokens and the inevitable ICO. And then we also decide that maybe this isn't necessarily the most economic path to go down. So in trying to think through, maybe I don't understand the technology, maybe I'm not seeing it right, it helps me to look at models of plenty of pretty smart people before. And the model I like to look to is a model that really represents the constraint of energy and the evolution of that as it evolves, as a model for what might happen to the energy system of the future. So let's go back 61 years. 61 years last year, the International Geophysical Year, with a competition between many different countries to put satellites, man-made satellites in space. And 61 years ago, America was getting very comfortable and very ready to launch their Vanguard series of satellites into space, and Russia gazumped them. They put up Sputnik 1 into space. Now, from an energy point of view, which is my interest, this weighs 80 kilograms or 180 pounds. And of that, 60% of that is taken up with batteries. So 10 of these batteries was what powered Sputnik 1. It weighed 6 times more, but that gives you a sense of the energy density improvement over time. But 10 of these batteries was what used to power Sputnik 1. It was made up of 3 batteries. One was to moderate the temperature inside of it, and the other 2 batteries were to transmit. Now, if you put a satellite into space and you want to measure something, the key important constraining variable is how long can you transmit data for. So they got 21 days out of this before the batteries ran out. So, lots of excitement. 30 days later, they decided we're going to stick something else up in space. This time, the constraint was didn't have too much space. We have to make sure that we've got space for a dog that's going to sit there. And what we're going to do is, in that energy system, if we're going to make it more efficient, how do we do that? Well, let's look at the thermal properties. So they shined it up so it became a bit more reflective. They stuck some heat blankets inside to make it thermally efficient. They changed some of the electrical components and started introducing transistors. And this time, and the other thing they did, which was quite interesting, was that in the period in which it oscillates around the Earth, which is 90 minutes, they only switched it on for 10 minutes each time, so it could transmit just to Russia. And by doing that, they dramatically reduced the amount of energy required. Okay, the US's turn. So the US later that year, the Vanguard program, sponsored by the Navy, decided they were going to put up their satellite into space. Everybody was watching very, very carefully to see what would happen, and lo and behold, the first Vanguard blew up on the launch pad, which wasn't very successful. So they rushed out, the Army stepped in, put up a derivative of the V2 rocket into space. And from an energy point of view, this weighed about 13 kilograms, and this time 40% of it was taken up with mercury batteries, and by using all transistors, they were able to make the energy last close to 3 or 4 months in terms of transmission time, which was a pretty remarkable achievement. The final one, and this is the one I like. So this is the Navy. So Vanguard 1 went up. Unkindly, it was called the Grapefruit by Khrushchev. So in the grand tradition of Spinal Tap, it was 1.5 kilograms as a satellite, and it had a battery, but it also had 6 solar panels. Each of those solar panels added up to 1 watt, and it was transmitting. It went up. The Navy had a big internal discussion. Do we want to try this disruptive technology? Is it too early? Will it work? It went up, and lo and behold, it worked for 6 years. It's still up in space, and it's the oldest piece of space junk up there at the moment. So the question is, what can we learn from that? So this is what you would call an intermittent, not unreliable energy source. And if you think about that, what that means from a supply side is that if you're going to design an energy system which is going to have an intermittent energy source, you have to actually over-design it. So sometimes it works too much, and sometimes it doesn't work at all. And from a demand side point of view, you have to think to yourself, well, I have to actually match how I use that energy to correlate with how the energy is supplied to me. So what you get is a situation where, yeah, it works for a while, sometimes it's too much energy and sometimes it's not enough. So if you then extrapolate this as one participant in an energy system to an entire energy system, this is the Australian electricity market today. This is a 180 terawatt hour market, and what you get here is that this is what's called a price duration curve, and it represents, in an energy market, what the price of energy is and what proportion of time it is for that price. So in a system like this, you get, for a certain period of time, prices are very high. They then come down, and as Florian was pointing out before, for most of the time they're quite low, and then for a very proportion of time, the prices are zero or negative, which is down here. And this problem increases and is exacerbated the more and more renewable energy you put into a system. So if you're thinking about the energy system for the future and what it's going to look like, for me, the house is actually going to become a new dynamic energy asset. These systems don't exist in isolation, and you're able to look at them from the way you operate those systems, and in particular, and fundamentally differently, you're able to look at it from a design point of view. Because if you think about it, in an energy system, a wholesale energy system, you have a distribution of prices depending on supply and demand at any point in time. From the network operators, you have a distribution of prices based on supply and demand at any point in time. And at the household level, you have the same thing, which represents people's propensity to use electricity in a sensible and in a way that meets their particular desire. So at the moment, one of the principal challenges of designing an efficient energy system is a lack of transparency in using data to be able to help people to make proper decisions. Because at the moment, if you decide how much solar you want to put on your roof, what determines that is your own particular habits. What do you do? How much do you lose electricity? Whereas in fact, what you should be doing is thinking to yourself, I have an asset, it has a certain amount of space, it has a certain way in which I can install solar energy in a certain pattern, and for me, I should be getting the price signals from my electricity company, from my distribution company, and from appliances for people who sit in my house that helps me understand how I should design the system, and probably more importantly, how I should operate that system. So, we've got a lot of work to do. We're going a fair way down this path, and I think in terms of the reason why I'm here is that a lot of the challenges to make this work are very much from a data-driven perspective. So first of all, you have to be able to communicate with all the energy activities that sit inside your house. You have to make sure you're talking to the right ones, you believe they're right ones. If people take actions to then use energy at times they wouldn't do before, you have to have confidence around the provenance of that. You have to have, and this is probably a crucial point, coordinated pricing. That if you don't have transparent pricing between different participants in this, you don't get an efficient system. Perhaps one of the most underrated ones is also risk allocation. Because if you're going to have energy or participants in an energy system, they have to actually recognise that there's a certain amount of risk with being a participant in an electricity system. And one of the things that we do, inherent to what we are as risk managers, is we price that risk. And so one of the roles that we think energy companies will actually have that will give you significant amount of benefit is helping people understand, manage and mitigate those risks. And the final thing, and perhaps not unimportantly, is the product point of view. If you're going to be working with people, you have to be able to stand in front of customers, get them to trust, get them to understand, share in the benefits with what you're doing with them, to make them an active, informed and consenting part of the ecosystem which you're trying to put together. So in closing, this isn't an energy problem. It's not a technology problem. I think it's a data coordination problem. And if you can get it right, you can have the most robust, low cost, most efficient, low carbon energy system available. Thank you.